Imagine the scene. It's the Battle of Fontenoy, 1745. Two of Europe's most disciplined armies, the French and a British-led coalition, are staring each other down across just a few dozen yards of grass. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder and the chilling silence between commands. After hours of cannon fire and maneuvering, it all comes down to this single moment. A line of elite British infantry advances on the French guards. A British officer, Captain Charles Hay, steps forward, pulls out a silver flask, and toasts his opponents. Then he shouts the legendary challenge. "Gentlemen of the French guards, fire first." The French count calmly replies, "Sir, we never fire first. Please do so yourselves." This wasn't just battlefield politeness. It was a deadly calculation at the heart of the single greatest military debate of the era. A question of nerve, discipline, and tactics that every general had to answer. Do you trust in a single devastating volley of lead or in the terrifying shock of cold steel? The choice between standing in a long, thin line or charging forward as a human battering ram. Welcome back to the deep dive. That moment at Fontenoy, that incredible theater of war, it just perfectly encapsulates the core strategic tension of the entire 18th century, doesn't it?
It really does. It's the quarrel of the orders, the querelle des ordres, as the French called it, which really pitted two fundamental concepts against each other.
A real fork in the road, tactically speaking.
Yeah, exactly. On one side, you had order mince, the thin line, and that was all about maximizing devastating firepower, getting as many muskets firing at once as possible.
Now the alternative.
The other side was order profound, the deep column. That was focused completely differently on maximizing the psychological and, the physical shock of just massed men, cold steel.
And for you listening, this isn't just, some dusty history lesson. This whole debate, fire versus steel, mass versus momentum, it didn't just define the Napoleonic Wars that came later. It really forced generals, entire institutions actually, to grapple with the limits of their technology and, crucially, the power of human ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, it's a conflict that still echoes in military thinking today.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to really unpack this decision. We want to examine how military doctrines, national constraints, things like budgets and manpower, and the technological limitations of the 18th century, how all that forced commanders into this choice.
Yeah, choosing between that single, maybe devastating volley or prioritizing the sheer shock of a massive human formation charging forward.
And crucially, we want to trace how that foundational choice eventually culminated, not really in a preference for one over the other, but in the incredible flexibility we start to see in the Napoleonic era. It became a blend of both.
Okay, so to really get why the line was so thin, why those volleys were so critical, we have to start with the star of the show, technologically speaking. The flintlock musket.
Definitely. For about a century, this weapon really dictated almost everything on the battlefield.
What defined it? What were its key characteristics?
Well, the flintlock was revolutionary for its time, mainly because it was more reliable, easier to use than matchlocks. But its fundamental characteristic, the thing you have to understand, is its low individual lethality.
Low lethality. So it wasn't actually that deadly.
For a single soldier, no, not really. Think about it. It's a smoothbore weapon firing a round lead ball. Accuracy was, atrocious past maybe 50 or 60 yards, even for a trained soldier.
50 yards? That's practically point-blank range.
It is. And beyond 100 yards, forget about it. Plus, it was slow to reload, kind of fragile, prone to misfires, especially in bad weather.
So if I'm standing there, an infantryman aiming at an enemy soldier 100 yards away, my chances of actually hitting him are pretty tiny.
Almost negligible, yeah. Individual skill with the musket wasn't really the deciding factor. You just couldn't rely on it.
Which forced the thinkers, the military theorists, to focus elsewhere.
Exactly. They had to accept that the main problem wasn't necessarily how to make the weapon itself better, but how to design the organization around the weapon to overcome its flaws. That low accuracy severely limited its effectiveness for any single soldier firing alone.
And that thinking right there is what gives birth to the order mince.
The thin line. Precisely. The linear tactic, stretching the formations out into these long lines, usually 2, sometimes 3 ranks deep, that was the organizational fix for the musket's inherent weakness.
It sounds like almost a statistical approach.
It was. It was an exercise in statistical compensation.
Yep.
Mask the fire by having hundreds, maybe thousands of men fire roughly simultaneously. The individual inaccuracies sort of cancel each other out.
So one guy missing doesn't matter if 100 guys firing together create a dense enough pattern of lead.
Exactly. If 100 soldiers fire in unison at an opposing line of 100 enemies, the sheer volume of projectiles hitting that target area virtually guarantees mass casualties, regardless of whether anyone was aiming particularly well.
That's the calculation then. A single scintlock, as the analysts put it, was not very dangerous on its own.
Right.
But a volley from a disciplined line, that was considered deadly. And the impact, both physical and moral, could be decisive. It's less about precision, more about area effect.
It's kind of area denial, yeah. And we can actually put some numbers on this need for massed fire. Military historians use a metric called the Theoretical Lethality Index, or TLI.
TLI. Okay, what does that measure?
It's a calculation. It combines the weapon's rate of fire, its accuracy, the projectile's velocity, probability of hitting a target at various ranges. Basically, a way to quantify how deadly a weapon system is on paper.
And the numbers for the flintlock era are quite revealing together.
They really are. Let's unpack that TLI number for the main infantry weapon. The flintlock musket had a calculated TLI of just 47.
47. That sounds incredibly low for the weapon that defined warfare for a century.
It is profoundly low, and it tells you that the infantry weren't effective because their individual weapons were good. They were effective because of how they were organized to use those weapons.
Okay, so how weak is Kami 7, really? How does it compare to other weapons on the same battlefield?
Well, let's look at the artillery of the time. The standard workhorse cannon, the French Gribeauval 12-pounder. Its calculated TLI was 3,970.
Whoa. Okay, wait. 3,970 compared to 47.
Yeah. The cannon was nearly 85 times more lethal, theoretically, than the musket carried by the individual infantryman.
That is a staggering difference.
Yep.
It completely changes how you think about the battlefield.
It does. That huge gap 47 versus almost 4,000, it highlights the whole strategic reality of the era. The infantry's main job often wasn't to win the firefight on their own. It was to hold ground, maybe deliver the final blow after the artillery had softened things up,
or deliver that devastating psychological shock with the synchronized volley fire.
Exactly. It proves the infantry had to rely on perfect coordination, density, discipline, not individual marksmanship.
And that absolute need for almost mechanical coordination, that leads us straight to the gold standard of the thin line. The Prussian model under Frederick the Great. They seem almost obsessed with rigidity.
They really were, and they arguably had to be. Now, Frederick the Great, he wasn't ignorant. He certainly knew about more flexible tactics, things like using light infantry, skirmishers.
Right, tactics other armies were starting to experiment with.
But he consciously chose not to adopt them widely in his main battle formations.
Why not? Wouldn't adding some flexibility, some light infantry harassing the enemy, have been an advantage? Especially against maybe less drilled opponents? Why stick so rigidly to the line?
Because Frederick's thinking, his core analysis, it wasn't just purely tactical, it was deeply institutional. He worried, maybe even feared, that allowing for more flexible light infantry tactics could actually undermine the specific kind of discipline he believed was essential for his particular army.
His particular army. What was different about it?
Well, the Prussian army relied very heavily on conscription, often including foreigners pressed into service and peasants recruited, sometimes quite forcibly, from Prussian lands. It didn't necessarily have that deep inherent national cohesion or patriotic fervor you see in, say, the later French Revolutionary armies.
Ah, I see. So the rigid linear formation wasn't just about maximizing firepower. It was also a kind of social and political control mechanism for the army itself.
Precisely. The line demanded total, almost robotic discipline. Every single soldier had to perform the complex manual of arms, the loading, priming, aiming, firing, all in perfect unison. And that unison was beaten into them through relentless, often incredibly brutal peacetime drilling.
If you let them break formation, act individually like skirmishers,
you risked them melting away, deserting or simply failing to rally and reform the crucial line under pressure. For Frederick, the mechanical perfection of the ordnance, the thin line, was absolutely necessary to maintain the cohesion and fighting power of his specific, somewhat fragile army structure.
That's a really powerful insight. So linear tactics weren't just born on the battlefield. They were largely peacetime developments, needing huge organizational structures, long-term funding, designed not just for fighting the enemy, but also for controlling your own troops. Optimized for that clash of equals where the slightest wobble, the smallest break in that perfect line could spell absolute disaster.
Right, and it was exactly that kind of mechanical rigidity, that potential brittleness, that critics, especially in France, started to really push back against. Which brings us neatly to the counter doctrine, the deep column. the ordre profond.
Okay, so the column, this fundamentally shifts the whole debate, right?
Yeah.
Away from maximizing firepower.
And towards maximizing momentum and shock. That's the core idea.
Describe the column for us. How did it look? How did it function differently?
Well, visually, it was the opposite of the thin line. It was massive, dense, sometimes 60 men wide, but maybe 16, 20, even 24 ranks deep, just a huge, solid block of humanity.
Wow.
It was designed to be more maneuverable than the long, unwieldy line, especially over broken ground, and it could be deployed relatively quickly. But its main tactical advantage, the reason you used it, was to maximize that shock effect. Pure, massed manpower hitting the enemy.
So less reliance on the first volley, more on just smashing into the enemy line, physically breaking it.
Physically and morally, using weight, density, and the bayonet. It wasn't about winning a firefight. It was about shattering the enemy's formation and will to resist through sheer impact.
If the thin line was like a finely tuned firing mechanism, the deep column was more like a human battering ram.
That's a great way to put it. Absolutely. And this doctrine, the column, it gained enormous traction during the French Revolutionary period.
Why then specifically?
Primarily because the French revolutionary government, facing invasion from all sides, simply didn't have the time or the resources or the cadre of experienced officers and NCOs needed to train their mass conscript armies to the level of perfection required for the ordre mince.
The Prussian drill sergeant model isn't feasible for them?
Not on that scale, not that quickly. Training troops to march forward in a dense column, relying more on élan, on morale and speed, rather than perfectly synchronized volleys, was just much, much faster.
The column wasn't entirely new, was it? And it had its own weaknesses, surely, like being incredibly vulnerable to fire on its flanks.
You're absolutely right. The column itself wasn't the final answer. It had been tried before, and yes, a dense column caught in the open by well-aimed artillery or flanking musket fire could be absolutely massacred. The real breakthrough, the innovation that changed everything, came later with Napoleon's tactical synthesis.
Okay, Napoleon. This is where, as you said, the deep dive gets really interesting, because the common idea is that Napoleon invented the column, or maybe had some kind of super weapon.
Which he didn't. It's a key point. Napoleon did not introduce a radical new tactical system from scratch, nor did he rely on a fundamentally new weapon. The muskets his men carried were essentially the same flintlocks his enemies used.
So what did he do? He took the existing tools, the flawed musket, the rigid line, the dense column,
and he combined them in new ways, driven by new and imaginative ideas into strategy and grand strategy. That was his genius. He didn't just throw out the line, for example. He changed its function within a larger, more flexible system. He developed an incredibly effective combined arms approach.
Combined arms. Okay, walk us through that. How did a typical Napoleonic battle unfold under this system? How did he blend fire and shock?
Right. So typically a French attack under Napoleon wouldn't start with the main line or columns advancing immediately. Instead, they'd often flood the field ahead of them with skirmishers tirailleurs.
Light infantry moving loosely.
Exactly. These weren't the soldiers drilled for the rigid line. They were deployed in open order, using cover, moving quickly. Their job was multifaceted. First, use flexible, aimed fire as best as they could with muskets to harass the enemy line, pick off officers, disrupt their formations.
Draw their fire too, presumably, make them waste their volleys.
Yes, draw their fire, cover the advance of the main French forces coming up behind, and maybe most importantly, psychologically disrupt the enemy's strict linear discipline. Think about it. If you're a soldier standing rigidly in a line, shoulder to shoulder, and you start taking casualties from enemies you can't easily see who are scattered and using cover, that perfect mechanical discipline starts to fray.
Okay, so the skirmishers are using the fire aspect, reminiscent of the orderman's philosophy, but in a much more mobile, disruptive, almost annoying way.
Precisely. They're prepping the battlefield. Then, often coordinated with a heavy artillery bombardment aimed at weakening a specific point in the enemy line. Only then, after the enemy was softened up, maybe getting disorganized, psychologically worn down,
That's when the hammer falls.
that's when Napoleon would unleash the deep columns. But they weren't just blundering forward blindly. They were aimed, directed at the weakened point identified by the skirmishers, and pounded by the artillery. The columns were reserved for the decisive thrust, using their sheer mass and momentum, the shock, to punch a physical hole through the now brittle enemy line.
It wasn't just fire or shock, it was fire then shock, coordinated.
Coordinated violence. That's the key. It's the ultimate expression, really, of doctrine and command overcoming material limitations. The weapons hadn't changed much since Frederick the Great's time, but the way Napoleon organized and directed his forces, that flexible application of skirmish fire, artillery concentration, and column shock that was revolutionary.
It really underscores the incredible, almost measurable lethality of command itself, doesn't it? The power of ideas.
Absolutely. You know that famous observation often attributed to one of his opponents, that Napoleon's mere presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 men?
Yeah.
It sounds like hyperbole, but it speaks to a real truth. This idea that superior organization, imaginative thinking, rapid decision-making, personal leadership, that these factors can often trump purely material superiority. A brilliant commander can take ordinary troops, ordinary weapons, and make them extraordinarily effective through coordination and intelligent application. The 18th century was often about drill. The Napoleonic era was about applying that drill within a much more dynamic combined arms framework.
We can even see this reflected in how armies occupied space. You mentioned trying to quantify force effectiveness and dispersion.
Yes, there's been some interesting work looking at the average area occupied by armies in different periods. For a typical Napoleonic army, say around 100,000 men, the average area they took up on the battlefield was about 8.05 square miles.
8 square miles. That sounds pretty dense, actually.
It is relatively dense, and that density shows that the column and line tactics Napoleon employed were perfectly compatible with the weapon they were using, the low lethality, short-range flintlock musket. The troops needed to be relatively close together to make that TLI of 47 actually count, either through volleys or column shock.
Okay, now let's jump forward a few decades. Let's look at the American Civil War, because that's when the primary infantry weapon fundamentally changes. We get the rifled musket, the conical mini-ball.
Right, a huge leap in technology, and the lethality numbers show it. The standard rifle musket used in the Civil War, firing that conical bullet, had a TLI of around 154.
154 compared to the flintlock's 47. So individual lethality more than tripled.
Dramatically increased, yes. But now, look at how those Civil War armies deployed. 100,000-man Union or Confederate army occupied, on average, about 10.3 square miles.
10.3. So only slightly more spread out than a Napoleonic army, maybe 25% more dispersed.
Exactly, a very slight increase in dispersion.
But that tiny increase in space doesn't seem to match the massive tripling of the weapon's lethality and effective range. Why were they still packed so closely together?
Because, by and large, they were still using tactics developed for the flintlock era. They were applying Napoleonic-style formations, dense lines, sometimes columns for assault, to a battlefield dominated by a vastly different, much deadlier, longer-range weapons system.
They hadn't caught up mentally.
The commanders hadn't yet fully grasped the implications. They hadn't figured out that the rifled musket demanded radical changes. Deep dispersion, rapid entrenchment, different ways of maneuvering. Instead, they marched their men forward in formations suited for the old short-range firefights. Only now they were getting cut down from 300, 400, even 500 yards away.
Which explains the horrific casualty rates and the prolonged, often inconclusive nature of many Civil War battles. The tactics, the ideas, the organization, they just hadn't caught up to the new material reality of the weapon.
That's the critical lesson here. Napoleon succeeded because he injected imaginative ideas into existing technological constraints. The Civil War tragically showed what happens when you introduce a revolutionary weapon, but try to force it into an outdated tactical and organizational framework. The minds of the generals lagged behind the metal in their soldiers' hands.
That comparison between the Napoleonic era and the Civil War, it really brings us to a broader and frankly kind of frustrating question about military history. Why does this lag happen? Why does adapting tactics, especially in response to weapons getting much deadlier, seem to take such a long time?
Yeah, it's a phenomenon observed throughout history. The analysis suggests that the whole process of adapting doctrine and tactics to weapons of significantly increased lethality is often marked by almost glacial slowness.
Glacial slowness. That really captures it. And it challenges the easy answer, right? The idea that soldiers are just inherently conservative or resistant to change.
It does. While individual conservatism might play a role sometimes, the bigger reasons seem to be structural, organizational, institutional, even economic.
Okay, so it's not just stubborn generals, it's the system itself that slows things down. What are the key systemic issues, the sort of discontinuities that drive this slowness?
Well, historians point to two basic discontinuities. The first one has to do with how technology developed and spread for much of history. Change was often secretive, compartmentalized,
Like,
meaning the innovation often came from individual craftsmen, artisans, maybe secretive inventors or guilds who guarded their techniques, their mysteries, very closely. There wasn't always good communication or collaboration between the person designing the weapon, the engineer, and the military commander who actually had to figure out how to use it effectively in battle.
that makes sense. The guy who knows how to build a better cannon doesn't necessarily know the best way to employ it tactically, and the general fighting the battle might not understand the weapon's full potential or limitations.
Exactly, a disconnect. The second discontinuity is arguably even more significant. It's the simple alternation of war and peace.
How does that slow things down?
Well, think about peacetime. Armies train, they conduct maneuvers, they run exercises. But these are, almost by definition, weak and partial tests of doctrine.
Because nobody actually dies. The bullets are blank. The consequences aren't real.
Right, there are no real stakes. Peacetime exercises can be useful for drilling basics, but they often end up confirming existing biases rather than rigorously challenging assumptions. It's too easy to rig the exercise or ignore inconvenient results that don't fit the preferred doctrine.
So you practice the way you think you should fight, not necessarily testing if that way is still valid.
Pretty much. War, on the other hand, is the authoritative and critical test. It's where theories meet brutal reality. Only in actual combat do you find out definitively if your tactics, your training, your equipment really work against a determined enemy who's also adapting.
And because major wars are infrequent.
The opportunities for that critical test are rare. Furthermore, if you look at military history, lessons learned in conflicts that didn't fit the dominant mold, say, small colonial wars, or even a huge conflict like the American Civil War, if you were a European power, were often dismissed or misinterpreted.
Why dismiss the Civil War? The scale was enormous.
Because it didn't involve the main European players fighting each other according to their established rules. It was seen as, well, somewhat unprofessional, fought by amateurs over vast distances with unclear objectives from a European perspective. So its bloody lessons about trenches and firepower weren't fully absorbed by the French, German, or British general staffs preparing for a future European war.
So the authoritative test only counts if it's between the right opponents in the right kind of war, which means by the time World War I rolls around in 1914.
European armies were, in many ways, still thinking tactically in terms developed for the Napoleonic Wars nearly a century earlier, despite now having machine guns, rapid-firing artillery, and bolt-action rifles. The technology had leaped forward, but the tactical mindset hadn't kept pace because the interim conflicts weren't considered truly authoritative tests of their core doctrines.
This slow pace, this need for an authoritative test, it really implies that adopting genuinely new tactics isn't just about tweaking the old ways. It's more like throwing out the old textbook and writing a new one.
That fits perfectly with theories of institutional change, like Kuhn's ideas about scientific revolutions. New tactics, fundamentally new ways of fighting, are often revolutionary. They require replacing the existing model or paradigm, the accepted pattern of thinking about warfare.
And that's hard. People are invested in the old model.
Deeply invested. A new idea, a new model, usually has to solve a critical problem that the old accepted model simply couldn't handle or even refused to acknowledge.
And sometimes, even when a better idea emerges, the old guard just holds on.
It happens. Sometimes, observers note, it's actually necessary to wait for the passing of a generation from authority before a truly new model can be fully accepted and implemented.
Wow, wait for the old generals to retire or die off.
Essentially, yes. New models often use different language, different concepts, different assumptions that just aren't easily understood or accepted by those who have spent their entire careers mastering the old ways. And the military, with its hierarchical structure and long career paths, can be particularly prone to this kind of generational lag.
Let's make this concrete with an example. You mentioned earlier the huge gap between weapon lethality and tactical dispersion in the Civil War and WWI. Is there a specific case study that really highlights how these non-tactical factors, budgets, existing inventory, generational change, can block innovation even when a better solution is known?
There's a fantastic, really telling example from the U.S. Army, the development and adoption of the 105mm howitzer.
The 105, okay, that became a legendary piece of artillery, right? The workhorse in World War II.
Absolutely. It was eventually deemed the workhorse of the Army, incredibly versatile and effective. And its TLI reflects that a calculated TLI of around 644,000.
644,000. Compared to the Griboval cannon's 4,000 and the Flintlock's 47, that's an astronomical leap in lethality.
A massive jump, yes. It fired a much heavier shell, more accurately, further, and could be used for both direct and indirect fire. A truly transformative weapon for infantry support.
So clearly a desirable weapon. When did the U.S. military leadership first realize they actually needed something like the 105?
The need was identified surprisingly early. The recommendation for a light field howitzer of roughly this caliber was first formally made way back in 1915.
1915, during World War I.
Yes. By the Treat Board, a group specifically tasked with studying the ongoing operations on the Western Front in Europe and figuring out what lessons the U.S. Army should learn. They saw the brutal reality of trench warfare and recognized the overwhelming need for a powerful, mobile, heavy, shell-firing support weapon that could deal with trenches and strongpoints, something more versatile than the standard 75mm field guns.
Okay, so the need was clearly identified in 1915, right in the thick of the war that demonstrated its necessity. When did the U.S. Army actually adopt the standard M2A 105mm howitzer that became the workhorse?
Not until March 1940.
1940. That's 25 years later. A quarter of a century between identifying the urgent need and actually fielding the standard weapon.
25 years.
Why on earth did it take so long? Was it military conservatism? Were generals just refusing to buy a better gun, sticking with the old ways?
No, that's the fascinating part. It wasn't really about tactical conservatism in this case. Senior military leaders, people like General Summerall, who was chief of staff, actively and strongly advocated for adopting a 105mm howitzer throughout the 1920s and 1930s. They knew they needed it.
So if the top brass wanted it, what was the bottleneck?
The delay was explicitly caused by two major non-tactical factors. First, severe, crippling budgetary restrictions imposed by Congress in the years following the immense cost of World War I. There was a strong isolationist and cost-cutting mood. Military spending was slashed aggressively.
Ah, the classic peace dividend.
Yeah.
The money simply wasn't there for developing and producing a major new artillery piece in large numbers.
Precisely. There was no funding for massive retooling and procurement. And the second factor was linked to that. The U.S. Army possessed absolutely gigantic stockpiles of older, existing World War I weapons, especially the French 75mm field guns, which they had adopted as their standard light artillery piece during that war.
So they had warehouses full of perfectly functional, albeit less capable, guns already paid for.
Tens of thousands of them. So from a purely logistical and economic standpoint, the internal logic of the bureaucracy of the system became, why should we spend millions of scarce dollars developing, testing, and producing a brand new howitzer, plus retraining gun crews, changing ammunition supply, modifying transport, when we have all these perfectly usable 75s sitting right here in inventory?
That's the ultimate inertia, isn't it? The sheer weight of the existing inventory prevents innovation, even when everyone knows there's a better tool available. Yeah. You can't afford, politically or financially, to replace what you already have in massive quantities.
Exactly. You stick with the older, less effective model until a major crisis, like the fall of France in 1940, and the suddenly very real threat of global war finally forces the issue and unlocks the necessary funding and political will.
It's a perfect illustration that the real barriers to adopting new tactics or technologies are often hidden away in the budget office, the logistics core, the inventory management spreadsheets, not necessarily on the training ground or in the minds of the tacticians. The human element, the organizational element, is so often the real bottleneck, not the technology itself. Okay, so we've established that tactics and technology are always fighting against these powerful currents of economics, institutional inertia, peacetime limitations. But ultimately, all of this, the thin line, the deep column, the flintlock volley, the 105mm shell, it's all aimed at influencing the human element on the battlefield, specifically morale.
That's absolutely critical to remember. Military analysis, looking at battles throughout history, consistently shows that military units, even entire armies, tend to collapse not when they reach some magic predetermined casualty percentage, but when their morale breaks, when their organization falls apart, when they lose the cohesion and the will to fight.
So firepower isn't just about inflicting casualties.
Its primary function, arguably, is moral. It's about paralyzing the opponent, disrupting their command and control, shattering their confidence, making them unable to coordinate and fight back effectively.
It's the disruption, the disorganization that truly defeats an enemy, maybe even more than the body count itself.
Very often, yes. And if you look at what causes the deepest, most rapid demoralization, the most effective combination seems to be firepower, mobility, and surprise. all pitted against ineffective command on the receiving end.
Ineffective command. That seems key.
It really is. The ultimate breakdown in morale often comes when soldiers realize or perceive that their leaders are incompetent, that they're being ordered into fruitless suicidal attacks with inadequate weapons or flawed tactics against an enemy who's better prepared or better led. That realization just cracks morale incredibly quickly.
You can almost see that playing out in the trenches of World War I. Commanders ordering wave after wave of infantry, often in dense formations, straight into machine gun fire. The troops eventually just couldn't do it anymore.
Exactly. The insistence on fruitless offensive operations with inadequate means is a surefire way to destroy your own army's morale.
Let's tie this back now to those historical periods we looked at earlier with the TLI and the dispersion data, the Napoleonic Wars, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Can we use that data, that comparison of occupied area versus weapon lethality, to definitively show when tactics and weapons were in sync, leading to success, and when they were out of sync, leading to failure and unnecessary bloodshed?
Yes, that comparison is really illuminating because it directly links the theoretical power of the weapon, the TLI, to the actual organization of the soldiers on the ground, represented by the area they occupied.
Okay, remind us, what did a successful compatible period look like in the numbers?
Right. The periods when weapons systems and the dominant tactics were broadly compatible, and we identified the Napoleonic Wars and World War II as prime examples, showed a specific relationship.
Napoleonic, with low TLI flintlocks and dense formations. World War II, with much higher TLI automatics, tanks, artillery, but also more dispersed, flexible, combined arms tactics.
Correct. In both of those periods, despite the vastly different technology levels, the average area occupied by a 100,000-man force was actually larger than the force's calculated theoretical lethality index for its primary weapons.
Larger area than the lethality index. What does that signify?
It suggests the troops were appropriately dispersed for the weapons they faced and the weapons they carried. They had enough space. They weren't overly crowded into the kill zones of the era's weapons. The tactical deployment, the space they used, effectively matched the reach and power of the weapons. The organization fit the technology.
Okay, so that's the sign of compatibility. Occupied area is greater than the TLI. Now, what about the transitional incompatible periods, the Civil War and World War I?
Those were the periods, as we discussed, when new, much higher lethality weapons, the rifled musket, than the machine gun, were introduced relatively quickly. But the older, denser tactics inherited from previous eras were still largely being used.
And the data shows.
In those transitional periods, the average occupied area for that 100,000-man force was less than the calculated lethality index of the dominant infantry weapons.
Less area than the lethality index. The armies were more crowded, more densely packed than the killing power of their own weapons would logically dictate.
Exactly. The weapons were individually deadly over much longer ranges, but the armies were still bunched together in formations developed for close-range fights with less lethal weapons.
So the soldiers were, in effect, standing shoulder to shoulder inside a high lethality kill zone that their own tactics had created, and which their commanders hadn't fully accounted for in their deployment.
That's precisely what this incompatibility check suggests. And the results were predictable. Horrific casualties, prolonged tactical stalemates, bloody failed offensives. It's quantitative evidence that the armies were not effectively utilizing their weapons capabilities, primarily because their doctrine demanded formations that unnecessarily exposed their own men to the very firepower they possessed. The organization lagged behind the technology.
So the ultimate takeaway, looking back across this whole two-century arc, from that stylized duel at Fontenoy all the way to modern warfare, seems pretty clear. Success doesn't come from just having the best weapon or the biggest mass of troops.
No. It requires a coherent tactical conception, a way of thinking that effectively coordinates all the available weapons and arms, infantry, artillery, cavalry, later tanks, and air power, to produce the maximum combined effect at the decisive point in time. It's about synergy, enhancing the overall shock of the action, not just individual components.
It's about the system, the combination, the idea behind the deployment.
It really is. Whether you look back at Gustavus Adolphus cleverly mixing pike squares with musket detachments in the 17th century, or Napoleon using those skirmishers to set up the decisive punch by the columns in the 19th, the enduring lesson from that old mince versus profonde debate is that the truly successful armies, the ones that consistently outperformed their rivals, were those that developed and mastered flexible combined arms systems. Systems that harnessed the power of ideas to adapt the tools they had to the realities of the battlefield.
So the 18th century argument wasn't truly solved by picking one side, thin line, or deep column. It was ultimately resolved, or maybe transcended, by commanders realizing that true effectiveness lay in skillfully combining both fire and shock, deployed flexibly, intelligently, based on the specific situation and the overall strategic goal. #tag outro. So we've really traced quite a journey today from that incredibly stylized, almost ritualistic tactical duel at Fontenoy, where commanders felt forced into that stark, binary choice, pure fire with the order mince or pure shock with the order profonde.
Right, a very rigid dichotomy.
All the way to the much more flexible, adaptable doctrines that emerged afterwards, particularly under Napoleon. It seems that simple dichotomy, fire or shock, was only really resolved when commanders grasped that peak effectiveness wasn't about choosing one, but about blending both, combining them strategically, adapted by, well, imaginative thinking.
And that fundamental principle, the importance of intelligent combination and adaptation over raw power, remains incredibly critical today, especially, maybe paradoxically, as modern weapons technology reaches what some analysts refer to as asymptotic values.
Asymptotic values. Okay, explain that term for us. What does that mean in this context?
It basically means that for certain types of weapons, particularly things like nuclear weapons, further increases in sheer destructive power start to yield diminishing returns. They approach a limit, an asymptote beyond which just making the weapon bigger or more powerful doesn't actually confer a significant additional strategic advantage.
So once you have weapons that can destroy cities, making them capable of destroying cities twice over doesn't fundamentally change the strategic calculus that much.
Exactly. The focus inevitably shifts. It moves away from simply maximizing raw destructive power and back towards organization, ideas, control, and application.
From maximizing the bang to tailoring the effect.
Precisely. The strategic and tactical emphasis shifts towards tailoring the yield, the delivery system, the mobility, the logistics, the intelligence gathering, tailoring the application of force to the specific target and the desired political or military outcome.
You see this even at the conventional level too, right?
Absolutely. In modern conventional combat, the focus isn't just on maximizing firepower, but on precision, on minimizing collateral damage, on tailoring the effect to, say, breach a specific obstacle without killing your own advancing troops right behind it, and then ensuring rapid exploitation of that breach. The successful modern infantry squad, for instance, needs, as some doctrines state, a complete arsenal, integrated at its own level, requiring entirely new types of smaller, more mobile, more precise, and more sophisticated conventional weapons.
Which brings us right back around full circle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The ultimate advantage on the battlefield, whether in 1745 or today, seems always to derive from superior organization, from innovative doctrine, from the strategic adaptation of ideas to make the best use of whatever technology is available.
Just as Napoleon took the humble, flawed flintlock musket, that weapon with a TLI of only 47, and transformed it, through organization and ideas, into the core component of a terrifyingly effective combined arms system that conquered Europe.
The quarrel of the orders, that old debate between fire and steel, line and column, ultimately showed us that the hardware, the weapons themselves, can only take you so far. It's the software, the human organization, the doctrine, the ideas built around that hardware that truly wins the day.